So let's take a look at this new concept of variables and apply what we already know about Playmaker to start to set up this idea of a point system or a health system. Now, I'm going to use the generic term of points for now, but then we can later modify this to health or anything else, any other kind of resource that we want to manage. So what I'm going to do, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a player manager object. And so the idea is that the player manager is going to be something that that controls and monitors our gameplay. And the idea here is that we know that we can attach these different state machines that we create to different kinds of objects, and we can destroy them and manipulate them, move them over time. And our logic might tell us to, if we're going to manage health or points, that we might want to attach that to the first person controller object. Since in fact it is our player character, why not use that to hold this information? But a better practice would be to create a separate game object that keeps track of all the variables inside the current game session or the current level, because there may come a condition when we want to destroy our player character, where we might want to convert our first person to a third person character, or maybe a vehicle where we no longer need the first person controller, but we want to keep the data of the player intact. And in that case, it wouldn't make sense to apply the data to the actual first person controller, because if we destroy that, we're going to destroy any data that's associated with it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a game object, and we're going to create an empty game object. Okay, now this empty game object, it just has a position in space, it has a transform component, and that's it. There's no other data associated with this at this point. I'm going to name this game object, I'm going to call this player manager. And the idea, again, is that it's going to keep track of some important information. Now, I'm going to jump back to my pickup cube for just a minute, and I want to talk about this idea of variables. In our previous demonstration, we created a variable, and in fact, let me just create another cube and create a state machine on that cube and just rebuild the scenario that we built last time, which was we did a rotation around a variable that I'll just call this rotate speed. I'll set that as a float, and I'll jump back into my state, and in the Y angle we'll use the rotate speed. Now I'll go back to my variable and I'll change that value back to 90, and I'll hit the play button. So we have a very similar setup as the previous presentation. Although my cube's not rotating, let me take a quick look at that. We want to rotate per second. There we go. So now it's starting to rotate. Now we can create these variables, and you'll notice that I have a variable called rotate speed. It happens to be attached to the cube. This variable is a local variable. Only this state machine can use this variable. Okay, so if I go over to my player manager, or I go over to my pickup cube, and if I look in here and I look at the variables that have been created, you can see there's no variables listed. But when I go back to my cube object and I go to variables, you can see that there's a rotate speed. So that data is directly associated with this state machine. Now there's two kinds of variables. There's local variables and there are global variables. And we want to use global variables when we want different state machines to be able to talk to the same set of data. So if I go over to my player manager object and I right click and I choose to add a state machine, and I go over to my variables tab, and instead of creating a local variable, which is the default, if I click on the global variables tab, you'll see that I open up a new window. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to new variable, and I'm going to call this, for the sake of the demo, I'll call this points. I want to start off lowercase. Okay, I'll call it points, and my variable type will be a float. Now I have a little bit of room here that I can play with, because I could declare this as an int, but I'm going to let it default to a float. Now the big difference between a float and an int, what I described in the earlier presentation, is that a float can include fractional or decimal numbers. So it's a floating point unit, so we can have values like those that show up in the position, rotation, and scale. An integer is a whole number, and because it's a whole number, it can be more efficient to do some math on, but we're kind of limited as to, in some ways, as to what we can do to it. Now, we can always convert different kinds of data back and forth to different kinds of types, which we may want to take advantage of in a minute. But for now, I'm simply going to call this new variable. I'll call it points, and maybe I'll even throw in a note that it's a global variable, or it'll become obvious that it is in fact global. I'll let it default to float, and I'll hit add. Now, Playmaker is gonna prompt me that it's storing this in a place where I can use it throughout the entire project. And now, because I've created a global variable, you'll notice that if I go to the player manager, and I'll just well, I'll open up a set rotation. I'm not going to, or excuse me, the rotate action. I'm not going to use this, but you'll notice that I have access to now this global variables drop-down menu. And anything that's in the global variables, I can use by any state machine. So currently I'm inside this player manager. If I now go to my cube and I go to my state and I just choose one of these drop-down menus, you can see that I can now go to globals and I can choose points. I'm not going to do that. But just to demonstrate the point, I'll also go to my pickup cube, and again, I'll go to idle. I don't really have a variable here that I can really quickly drop down, so I'll just add a rotate, and you can see that I can use that points. I can use that points variable at any place inside my scene, and that can be really, really handy. So I'm just going to remove this rotate action. I'm going to select my cube, and even though I had the cube selected when I created my global variable, when I delete my cube, I still have that global variable information. Now, I want to point out that global variables can be a little less efficient than local variables. So as long as you're only going to use that data on the state machine that you're using, there's no reason to do anything other than make a local variable. If you want to have two or more different state machines share that information, that's a good indicator that you want to use a global variable. So I have this global variable. It's called points. I'm going to go to my player manager and I'm going to get rid of my rotate action. I'll just click on this little cog here. I'll click on that little settings cog. I'll choose to remove action because I really don't want my player manager to rotate. But what I want to do is I want to start to listen and output the value of points. Now, when it comes to points, or when it comes to printing content to screen, we have a couple of different options, but we're going to run into a little bit of a glitch here. If I go into GUI, the GUI category, and I go down and find GUI label, if I double click on that, what that will do is this will print a graphic user interface label on screen somewhere, and it'll print out whatever is in this text field. And so I'll just type in hello world. It's a pretty classic testing phrase, and I'll just let that default. Now we have this value of top and left, which we'll take a look at. That's where this content is going to render on screen. But for now, I'm just going to hit the play button, and I'll look somewhere up in the top left corner of my window, and you can see that I have this value that pops up that says hello world. Now it's nested in the top left hand corner, and I want it to kind of come off that corner just a minute, just a little bit. And what we'll do is we'll push this off the left side of the screen and the top side of the screen by a value. Now from the left and from the top, we're looking at a normalized screen, and what that means is that the top left hand corner is going to be 0. The bottom right hand corner is going to be 1 based on these values. So if I were to push the left value all the way over to 1, what that would do is that would set the text over here in the top right hand corner. The notion of a normalized screen is a value from 0 to 1. It happens to be a floating point variable or value. So we can do something like from the left side, I'll do 0.1. And from the top, I'll do point maybe 2, and we'll see what that gives us. I'll hit the play button. I'll take a look up here. Now the point 1 from the left side looks a little too much, and definitely the point 2 looks to be a little much. So I'm going to go back in and I'll do like a 0.05 by 0.05. Hit return, and I'll hit the play button and see how that works out. So that looks to be a little bit more comfortable. As a placeholder, we have this text in the top left-hand corner. It's saying hello world. Our goal is that we want to output some text that's the value of points in that field. So now you may remember when we created our global variable, and I'll just click on my global variable window to take a look at this. I'm going to select that variable that we created called points. It happens to be a float variable. And I'm going to set, just for the sake of testing this, I'm going to set my float variable, my default value, to 10, and I'll close this global variables window. Now, if I wanted to print the value of my points in this field of text, instead of printing hello world, I want to print my value of points. My logic tells me that I can click on this little button, which allows me to change back and forth between hard values and variables. And when I click on this drop-down menu, you can see that I can't choose anything, or at least I can't choose. I don't have any legal variable types right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my variable, my local variable, and I'm going to create a new kind of variable. This variable is going to be, I'll call it points string. Okay, so it's ultimately going to be the value of my points converted into a string, and the variable type that I'm going to create is a string variable, and I'll hit the add button. Now, if I go back to my state and I go back to the text, that's the same place where we typed in hello world. If I click on that drop down menu, you can see that now I can use the points string. There's currently no value in the points string, and I can tell that because I'm debug checking this value. It's empty. If I go back to my variables and I select my points string, I can enter the string value of hello world, just like we had before. The difference, if I go back to my state, is that that is not hard-coded in the field. That's looking at a variable. So now when I hit the play button, in the top left-hand corner, I have the value of a variable that's printing that happens to say hello world. Now, what I want to do is I want to get the value of my points float, that global points float, and convert it into a string that we can use. And somewhere in here, in the actions field, in the actions category list, is an action that will convert one variable type to another. And I probably could dig for it. I have a pretty good idea of where it's at, but there's this really nice search field up here that we can type in. And so if we remember that maybe we're looking for a rotate command, we can type in rotate, and we can see all the different commands that reference, or the different actions that reference rotate, and it tells me what category it's in. What I'm looking to do is I'm looking for a convert, and I can see that there's actually a category called convert, so I'll just X this out. I'll go into the convert, and you can see that I can convert one float type to another. What I'm interested in doing is I'm interested in converting a float to a string, and I'll just borrow this same action that I'm using. I'll double click, and I'm going to move this up to the top of the stack just so that I don't get any strange results. So let's try that again. I'm going to take my convert float to string, and what I want to convert, you'll see it says the float variable that I want to convert. I'll go find my float variable. It's a global points, and the string variable that I want to convert it to is the string variable that I created. I'm not going to worry about the format. I do want to do this every frame because presumably my points variable is going to change based on what kind of interactions that I have in my screen. So here's the logic. I have a player manager. On that player manager, I have a local variable. It's called points string. It's a string type variable, and that's being printed to screen using a GUI label. The GUI label text is using that variable of points string, which initially has the value of hello world. Once we run this, we're going to convert a float to a string. So we're going to start with our global points. We're going to store that in our points string. So it says hello world for now, but the moment that we hit the play button, that should rewrite with the current value of 10. So let's hit the play button, see what we get here. And you can see that as soon as I hit the play button, that string variable immediately changed to 10. And I can see it printing out on screen in the top left-hand corner. Now what we want to do is we want to start to talk to other objects inside our environment. When we pick them up, we want to do a little bit of math, and we either want to add to or subtract from our points variable. But we'll do that in the next presentation.